Hello and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown.
These days I will bring you a short update on the discussion on strikes into Russia, what they mean, what they actually change on the battlefield, and of course whether they will lead to World War III or not, and how that relates to the currently changed Russian nuclear doctrine and what might happen actually. So first of all, let's dial into things. The Biden administration has allowed Ukraine to strike with the ATACMS missile system into Russia, but in conjunction with the Kursk operation. North Korean soldiers are employed there, at least to some extent, and the Biden administration, NATO, other Western leaders have actually long before signaled that this will have consequences. So correspondingly now, of course, there are consequences. Russia knew that there will be consequences, and the West would have lost credibility if there were none. However, at the current point, everything suggests that the permission to strike inside Russia is actually bound to the Kursk operation, to its vicinity. It should have an operative relationship with that operation, so reserves, ammunition stockpiles, weapon systems, training grounds, etc., that are used by the Russian armed forces to drive Ukrainians out of Kursk. These things may be attacked, at least as things stand now. Now, of course, that can be handled more flexible if we want to. As I have said many times before, there is no loose Ukrainian cannon. All targets that are targeted by Western long-range weapon systems are cleared in advance with the Western donors. There are multiple phone calls each week between Ukrainians and Western counterparts to clear the list of targets eligible for long-range strike. There is no problem on regulating this, a bit more flexible and not putting up fixed red lines, but still have a mean of retaining control over possible escalations if one fears that these might happen. There's nothing hugely special about this, and actually it was, to be honest, it was about time that these restrictions that only gave credibility to Russian nuclear threats, these red lines were basically revoked, at least to some point. Which brings me to the next topic. Are the Russians going ballistic? Are they going nuclear? The second thing, of course, we have observed is that the Russians have a new nuclear doctrine, and it's, again, a 6-page boring document that brings a little thing news, or at least if you compare it with the old 2020 version, but some significant changes if you were to take it too seriously. And that is, of course, that Russia now has considerably lowered the theoretical threshold for the use of nuclear weapons to designate all countries, conventionally armed countries that are either aligned or receive support from a nuclear power and attack Russia, could be subject to a Russian nuclear strike. Now, of course, this definition can be bounded very widely and loosely if one wants to, because who defines support? What is essentially support, and what then qualifies a real attack? On all that, the doctrine is very blurry. It also contains a very long list of developments that Russia doesn't like and doesn't see, and would like to deter by nuclear means. Is it now, of course, to be taken all too seriously? I doubt. So first, let's dive into the value of such documents. Real nuclear doctrine, so when and where to use nuclear weapons. These were, during the Cold War, usually classified. They were talked publicly about it to leave the other side in doubt what would actually happen if one would risk an escalation. Of course, there was some kind of nuclear doctrine. There was a classified nuclear doctrine because the Soviet Union had to at least partially inform, and I emphasize partially inform, there was also pact subjects on how the Soviet Union would actually conduct the war and under which conditions conduct nuclear strikes. Now, I say partially informed because the real war plans of the Soviet Union were never shared with the Warsaw Pact allies. The real Soviet classified documents weren't, but of course the Soviet General Staff always conducted war games with the general staffs of their Warsaw Pact allies, and in these war games they basically reenact something very close to the official doctrine, and that gave Warsaw Pact allies a feeling and understanding of how their role would be if the war would unfold. That was the old day. Now, how did that change after the Cold War? Fundamentally, for Russia, little changed, but that the Americans started to be more transparent, issuing the nuclear posture review in the 90s, trying to reassure the Russian Federation that nuclear weapons would not be part of the American expeditionary warfare, Americans intervening in Bosnia, etc. The second thing is that with new arms control treaties and transparency measures, there was a big emphasis on being more transparent and pressure on the West on being more transparent in the UN framework and framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as with bilateral forums with the United States on nuclear weapons doctrine and release practices. At the same time, Russia then had no allies anymore. The Warsaw Pact disintegrated and Russia was there alone. So Russia actually started to be very defensive and progressive when it came to international fora, but this kind of progressiveness, having a very high threshold, talking about non-first use, talking about that nuclear deterrence is only there to keep away existential threats against the existence of the state, etc., did not match its post-Shan practices of forward deploying Iskanders, conducting maneuvers, simulating nuclear strikes on other countries, etc. Especially, of course, then under Vladimir Putin. So there was always a mismatch between official declared policies and practice or preparations of the Russian armed forces, which, in my personal view, should have given us a thought on how seriously we should have actually taken all these declared Russian policies. In practice, the thing is that if Putin thinks that a nuclear employment benefits the interests of the Russian Federation, he will probably employ nuclear weapons. Whether he finds an exact pretext in the Russian doctrine is a secondary matter, and if you see how Russia can bend reality to the way that it fits its own interests, even a relatively restrictive nuclear posture or nuclear doctrine could have been permissively interpreted ex post if they really wanted to use nuclear weapons. So yes, they have updated the nuclear doctrine, but so what? The real thing whether Putin will use nuclear weapon or will not use nuclear weapon depend on the situation on the ground and whether it's actually beneficial, whether Russia would gain something and or would estimate the costs of losing something. And here, of course, the debates spread on where we are in Ukraine. So first of all, if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine as such, would it make Russia win the war? No. It would have to use multiple nuclear weapons to sustainably destroy the Ukrainian armed forces. Also on that, one needs to remind that the Ukrainian armed forces by now are far more spread out and decentralized in their posture at the front lines compared to a Warsaw Pact or Cold War style army, because the mass application of drones and long-range artillery forces every army to spread out its forces and its weapon systems. Otherwise, they would be a concentrated target to be hit by conventional means. But that also says that it's actually much more difficult to eradicate an entire Ukrainian brigade than it was to eradicate an entire NATO brigade or Warsaw Pact regiment during the Cold War, because they're much more spread out over a much wider area. And hence the military effect, the pure military effect of a nuclear release would be diminished. The second thing is, of course, that the international environment is not very permissive for a Russian nuclear strike. China has made it clear that this would be something it does not allow or does not want. The Chinese are very worried that such a move would tip South Korea or other East Asian states over the nuclear proliferation threshold, and that they would have then more concerned nuclear neighbors who think that just sort of international order and international law doesn't protect them from Chinese nuclear weapons, so they need to get their own ones. India as well, South Africa as well. This is the only red lines they actually have, and Russia is dependent economically on them. Worse for them, the Americans have threatened Russia that this would have consequences in Ukraine with the entry of US weapons into the war, in the form of the Americans directly targeting Russian assets connected with the war in Ukraine. And that, given the amount of firepower that the US Air Force Europe has alone, plus Navy, could actually be very damaging, if not catastrophic, for the Russian war aim in Ukraine. So Putin would actually rather quickly lose the war instead of winning it. Even more dangerous, it would of course bring Russia on a path of direct escalation with NATO and the United States, which Russia for the time being cannot afford. The Russian armed forces are in Ukraine, they're bogged down there. Russia does not have a second army somewhere to conduct a land war against NATO. It does not have more cruise missiles and Iskanders and Kinzhals that it uses in its firing campaigns against Ukraine. There is not much of a strategic reserve left. So all means to control an escalation, conventionally land forces plus long-range strike, are bogged down or occupied in Ukraine, and any confrontation with the West would immediately go nuclear. And that is an exchange Russia only can lose. So it's not a viable proposition for a political bargain, a win for Russia if it would actually enter the race, at the time at least. Of course, there is a bit of nervosity how serious Biden's threats are as he's about to leave office. We are, of course, now in a bit more dangerous situation than we were some month ago. But on the other hand, it is very unlikely that the Americans would completely fall down their guards. Even with the Trump administration, the Republicans know they have a minimum interest of maintaining credibility in the nuclear realm. So for the time being, the actual Russian possibilities to escalate are dim. That's also why Russia, of course, tries to punish the West by any other means than means that would trigger Article 5 or an entry of NATO into war. They sabotage our cables, they hire thugs to make arson attacks on infrastructure in Europe, cyber attacks up and down the country, information war. All these are means that would never trigger Article 5, and there are reasons why Russia absolutely wants to avoid Article 5, because that would bring them on the road to uncontrolled situations or defeat, and Putin as a control freak really wants to avoid that. So what are they going to do as a response now? Well, they might launch a conventionally tipped missile and throw it at a target in Ukraine. Symbolically, they might make a show of force, maneuver something, but they are very unlikely to do something more than that. And even if they would start to prepare, let me be reminded that Western intelligence, particularly US intelligence, has a very close eye on what they're actually doing on the nuclear field. And there is then the possibility to also alter NATO's nuclear posture and signal the Russians, well, keep that in your pocket, my dear friends. For all who are worried about World War III, no, not gonna happen yet. Because there's a big mistake in calculation in the West that really puzzles me and is really mind-boggling. Everybody seems to be worried about the Russian escalation against NATO when Russia is in the worst situation in decades, actually since the early 30s, to conduct a big war in Europe, apart from Ukraine, because they're bogged down there. During all times, even during the slump in the 90s, at least the Russian army was there and not preoccupied with big, large other maneuver wars. They were preoccupied with Chechnya. That was bad enough, but it was not a huge maneuver war that consumed endless resources and drowned the strategic reserves of the Russian armed forces. But strangely enough, now Europeans, particularly Germans, are so afraid of Russia escalating. With what, where, how, and what would it end with? Nobody seems to really have an answer to these questions, but they're talking about escalation. On the other hand, there are people in Berlin, especially close to the Chancellor, who think that actually Russia winning is not such a big risk to Europe and Germany, and still is more manageable than, for example, Russia losing and falling apart. Well, then if Russia wins, if Russia is not bogged down in Ukraine, if the Russian army is successful, if the Russian army is given time to rearm, to restock, to refine its doctrines, to take the lessons learned from the war, if the confidence of having won a war is filling the ranks of the Russian army instead of the confusion of why did this end up in such a quagmire so quickly, then actually Russia becomes a real problem. Then actually they have the free means, they have then the self-confidence to go into an escalation race. They would have years to produce cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, stockpile them for escalation control, conventionally as well as nuclear. Then, of course, they would have a land force that is recreated, that can attack various countries that can back certain contingencies of escalation. They can be very flexible in that. They have, with their partnership with China, basically secured the southern and eastern frontier. They could concentrate on Europe with their conventional military force. So if we talk about the risk of escalation, then the risk of escalation with Russia is not short-term, and it's not related to current ATACMS in Ukraine or in Russia. Then it's long-term. How the war will end and how the end of the war will either enable or not enable Russia to do further stupid things. That's the big question, and that's what we're not debating, and that is what seemingly does not bother anybody or drive up the fears in public debates. Well, it actually should, because that's the real dangerous thing in the whole war. An army that is bogged down is not the dangerous thing for us. It's dangerous for Ukrainians, but we are free to support Ukraine. Now, later we will have other problems.